If you've been around gaming long enough to remember the 2010s, then you've probably heard of the name Zoe Quinn. For some people, Quinn is seen as the face of Gamergate, a developer whose vulnerable interactive diary about depression made them the target of internet mobs and misogynist crusades. For others, Quinn represents something far less sympathetic, a career inflated by connections, controversy, and the willingness to turn private drama into public theatre. So in this video, I'm not here to refight the culture war, but run through with you all a story of self-destruction that not only did immense damage to the person who started the fires, but countless others in the game industry as well. I am Lady Decade, and if you like your tales about gaming spicy, then hit that subscribe button, because this is the story of a woman who ruined her own life. Modern gaming can be ridiculously expensive and predatory today, but fortunately bargains do still exist, and with my links you can slice massive chunks off the most popular releases around. We're talking 30% off the critically acclaimed Ark Raiders, 52% off Expedition 33, and brace yourself, 97% off of one of my all-time favourites, Shadow of Mordor, bringing that one down to less than $2. In fact, clicking below you can save up to 90% off of thousands of games. But since it's Black Friday weekend, here's the stupid part that makes it very fun. Every single hour, someone gets their entire basket refunded. You just buy what you were going to buy anyway, and if the system picks you, your whole order goes to zero. There are 96 chances across the weekend, one every hour, and they post the winners in their Discord. So it's not one of those mysterious corporate winner situations, they literally just list them. So if you're thinking, oh, I'll wait until payday, don't. Use my special Black Friday link, which takes you straight to their event page. It counts for the refunds, and you can check back each day as new games unlock, and then join their Discord to see who the winners are. It's only this weekend, and it genuinely is even better than their usual discounts, which is saying something. So happy gaming and happy savings. Before Quinn became a flashpoint in a culture war, she was a debut developer releasing a small personal project. Depression Quest, published in 2013, is a text-based interactive narrative built in Twine that attempts to depict the everyday limits faced by someone living with clinical depression. It was not reviewed as a game to play, but as a statement to witness. Polygon described it as an experience that helps dispel myths about depression, framing it as a kind of public health tool rather than a commercial product. Rock, Paper, Shotgun followed the same pattern, discussing what the game meant rather than how it played. In a media environment eager to show that games could address serious subjects, Depression Quest became a confessional artifact. To criticise its structure or simplicity risked sounding like a critique of the subject matter itself. And that dynamic did something unusual. It created a protective bubble around the work. The game was positioned as an act of vulnerability, a brave disclosure, and once something is framed in those terms, traditional criticism becomes socially dangerous. Reviewer norms collapsed, and nobody wanted to be the one who said out loud that many of the branching paths simply locked options behind text reading. You were too depressed to do that, or that the experience was essentially a static web page with a mood. In that climate, praise functioned as virtue, and silence became the only acceptable alternative to approval. That reception mattered because of the context Quinn arrived from. The early 2010s indie scene did not operate like a workplace with rules and hierarchies, it operated like a social circle. Developers, journalists, streamers, charity organisers and event staff blurred professional and personal relationships constantly. Friends promoted each other's projects, dated each other, shared flats and hotel rooms, and moved between collaborations with no expectations of impartiality. There was no HR department, no disclosure protocol, no sense that someone who spoke publicly about their vulnerabilities might later be expected to maintain an arm's length relationship with the people reporting on them. The currency of the space was emotional disclosure, and Quinn, who introduced herself through a game about internal struggle, was welcomed naturally into it. The backlash didn't start with slogans or any organised movement, it began with friction, a collision between the expectations of a traditional gaming audience and a new critical culture that treated Depression Quest as something beyond entertainment. Many players didn't simply understand why a minimalist Twine project was suddenly being elevated to the same cultural pedestal as a full-scale commercial release, or why journalists were suddenly insisting that its value was moral, not mechanical. That frustration, mixed with the perception that Quinn, bolstered by relationships within the indie press scene, was being championed for reasons unrelated to craft. In the early stages, complaints were mostly about attention, access, and whether the media tastemakers were manufacturing a narrative that ordinary gamers were expected to applaud. But that was only the beginning of this wild tale. For most people who encountered Quinn in 2014, the first real moment she entered their world was not through Depression Quest or indie showcases, but through a sprawling personal document written by her former partner, Erin Gioni. It would quickly be known online as the Zoe Post. It did not read like a breakup tantrum or a bitter blog entry. It read like a catalogue with screenshots, message logs, timestamps, annotated conversations, and flowcharts of overlapping relationships. Gioni did not discuss politics, gaming culture, or misogyny. He presented his account of a relationship he believed had been dishonest, and he attempted to prove it in the most forensic manner he could possibly manage. But whatever the intent, the tone made people interpret it as evidence rather than gossip. Speaking of gossip and all of the turmoil surrounding the modern gaming industry, if you're sick of it all, let me take you back to the past to play the pretty games that last. Recently, I've opened a new channel called Lady Arcade where I upload content exclusively celebrating retro gaming. In the last 3 weeks, we have looked at some of the craziest Famiclone stories of all time: Poland's Pegasus, Spain's Dido, and the ludicrously named Star Trek console. So if you are sick of modern gaming on YouTube, click the link in the pinned comments and subscribe to Lady Arcade now. The detail that metastasized into headlines was the implication that Quinn had been romantically involved with Kotaku journalist Nathan Grayson at a time that overlapped with professional coverage. It is important to be explicit here because this is where an entire decade of folklore eclipsed the record. Gioni never actually claimed that Quinn exchanged sex for reviews. His allegation was that she had been in several concurrent romantic relationships and that one of those partners was a journalist who had previously written about a game jam with which she was associated with. The sex for review slogan was an invention of third-party commentary that did not stop her very vocal detractors from running with it. Kotaku responded in the narrowest possible terms. Editor-in-chief Stephen Totilo issued a statement. Nathan Grayson did not review Depression Quest. Clarified that Grayson had once written about Quinn in the context of a failed game jam, and that the romantic relationship began only after that article had been published. The response did not address broader ethical norms, nor the appearance of impropriety when a journalist covers a figure with whom they later become intimate. It simply closed the door on one specific allegation. There was no review, and therefore the most traditional standard of review ethics had not been breached. But then again, what can you expect from sleazy game journalists? Of course they're not going to take accountability for anything. Kotaku's response helped foster an unanswered space, the one between factual denial and ethical expectations, which is where the conflict grew. To players who had never been a part of the indie circuit, the situation resembled any other industry. If a reporter has personal ties to their subject, the audience expects transparency, or at least acknowledgement. In the indie scene, those lines had never been codified. Relationships, friendships, and collaborations were interwoven. Studios regularly socialized with streamers, journalists lived with developers, and everyone moved between these roles without the formality expected of larger professional environments. What outsiders interpreted as a credibility problem, insiders understood as the normal texture of a close-knit creative community. Neither interpretation was irrational, but they were incompatible. The result was that two entirely different conversations became fused into one argument. One group believed that they were talking about ethics, conflicts of interest, and disclosure in a media ecosystem that did not acknowledge its own intimacy. The other believed that they were reacting to harassment, defending developers, and resisting a backlash against women who had entered gaming culture. Each group had enough observable facts to sustain its worldview, and neither had any incentive to accept the frame of the other. The Zoe post itself did not create Gamergate, but it crystallised the divide into something visible, an industry that had no boundaries colliding with an audience that expected them, each convinced the other was acting in bad faith. Next time you hear the mainstream media tell you that Gamergate was just about toxic, misogynistic gamers, please remember that they are lying to you. What followed the Zoe post was not a debate. It was a collision between two fundamentally different interpretations of the same set of events. A broad group of ordinary players saw an industry with blurred boundaries, and a much smaller and highly visible fringe reacting differently, using the moment to harass Quinn, her family, and anyone publicly associated with her. When media outlets, activists, and academics responded, they did not distinguish between these behaviours. They treated all criticism as harassment, and in doing so, the conflict hardened before any meaningful discussion could take place. Many of the people who knew Quinn personally or admired her for her openness responded to any kind of negative criticism of the depression quest or Quinn's behaviour simply as a continuation of the harassment. Ethical or organisational disputes were often translated into misogyny. And when the fine young capitalists alleged that Quinn's involvement had harmed their woman-focused game jam, the debate did not centre on logistics or miscommunication. It was largely understood as another example of hostility towards women in games. The organisation later reconciled with Quinn, and no independent process ever clarified responsibility. What lingered was the impression that any conflict around her could be treated as evidence of the same pattern: critics on one side, misogyny on the other. Kotaku reported that she had left her home after receiving death threats, and that her social security number, hidden, then leaked online, had circulated alongside nude photographs. These were, of course, not caustic forum posts or snide comments. These were actually criminal acts. The press treated them as proof that a vulnerable creative figure, someone whose first published work revolved around depression, had become the victim of internet cruelty. That posture was reinforced by headline voices. Seeking to define the moment, journalist Lee Alexander argued that gamers don't have to be your audience. Gamers are over, describing the stereotypical fan as young men queuing with plush mushroom hats who don't know how to dress or behave, before delivering her infamous dismissal of them as obtuse shitslingers, wailing hyper-consumers, childish internet arguers. Around the same time, developer Brianna Wu, who had tweeted mockingly at hostile critics, became the subject of doxing and threats, culminating in an incident in which he says she was forced to flee her home for safety after receiving explicit messages detailing how she would be murdered. Wu told the BBC that every woman I know is terrified that what happened to me will happen to them next, calling the environment a true campaign of terror on women in the field. These responses did not distinguish between bad faith harassment and legitimate criticism. They merged the two into a single adversary, which begins to make it all the more clear as to why the backlash would only intensify. What disappeared during this period was proportionality. Some observers looked at Quinn's professional circle, the friendships, the blurred boundaries, the improvised professionalism of the indie scene, and wondered whether it was appropriate for a space so intertwined to be covered as if it operated by industry standards. Others saw the threats, the doxing, the press coverage, and concluded that questioning her at all was an act of cruelty. These instincts were rarely permitted to coexist. One impulse described misconduct and the other described misogyny, and both views were weaponized against each other. For Quinn, the situation was not about professionalism, it was about survival. In her interview with Vox, she said that Gioni had launched an online harassment campaign with me as the target, engineered the way marketers would design an ad, and described how her father, who had no involvement in the industry, was receiving phone calls asking, "What's this Five Guys Burgers and Lies thing that people keep calling and screaming at me?" She did not see a messy breakup becoming public in the worst possible way. She saw a coordinated attack that spilt into her offline life and dragged her family into it. But many players did not interpret Quinn as the protagonist of a conspiracy against women. They saw an insular industry reacting to uncomfortable questions with contempt. They watched respected commentators publicly dismiss them. Lee Alexander's widely cited editorial did not engage with the ethical concerns, it discarded the audiences raising them. For people who had bought consoles, written fan reviews, attended LAN parties, and kept small studios alive for repurchases and word of mouth, the message did not read as a plea for better behaviour. It read as eviction. At the same time, activist voices framed the entire episode as proof of entrenched misogyny rather than an example of dysfunctional professional boundaries. For those who genuinely believed that they were raising issues of disclosure, proximity and journalistic standards, seeing themselves characterised as agents of terror was bewildering. Once mainstream outlets adopted the misogyny framing, the discussion was no longer about facts but identity. Players who felt dismissed did not fade away, they dug in. Supporters who believed Quinn was being targeted did the same. No institution emerged to clarify that ethics concerns and harassment were separate categories populated by different people. Instead, the distinction collapsed entirely. Individuals who might otherwise have disengaged quietly came to believe they needed to defend themselves, and every new exchange, no matter how minor, became proof of bad faith to someone. Gamergate certainly did not invent harassment, nor did it invent conflicts of interest in journalism. What it exposed, though, was just how volatile those forces become when neither side trusts the intentions of the other. Once suspicion turned into identity, there was nothing left to negotiate. The debate was not about Quinn anymore. She simply happened to be standing where two incompatible realities collided and refused to separate. Now, while that was the Gamergate incident in a nutshell, years after the Zoe post, Quinn made another public accusation, this time concerning Canadian developer Alec Holoka, co-creator of Night in the Woods. In August 2019, Quinn published a thread on Twitter alleging emotional and sexual abuse. The post did not arrive in the form of documentation. There was no screenshots, no message logs, no corroborating materials. It was a personal account of past behaviour in a private relationship presented to a public audience rather than through a legal or investigative channel. The reaction from Holoka's colleagues was immediate. The development team behind Night in the Woods, Infinite Fall, issued a statement. "Today, we're cutting ties with Alec Holoka. We are thankful for the time we spent working with him, but this was the right thing to do." The announcement did not outline an internal review, provide a timeline of events, or present any findings that informed the decision. It did not accuse Holoka of any criminal act. It simply ended their professional association in response to the accusation. But sadly, this wasn't even the worst of the situation. Within days, the news emerged that Holoka had died. His sister Eileen shared a statement online. She wrote, "Alex struggled with mood and personality disorders. He was a victim of abuse. He was an abuser, and he ultimately took his own life this morning." She explained that the family had tried to help him as much as we could, but he was very difficult to help, and she explicitly asked the public not to use the incident as ammunition against others, saying that their family did not want any harassment of anyone. Her statement attempted to communicate the complexity of her brother's life, acknowledging both the pain he caused and the pain he carried, without turning either into a weapon. So those are the facts that are available to the public. They establish that Quinn made an allegation. that Infinite Fall severed professional ties, that Holoka's sister described a long history of severe mental health struggles, and that he died shortly after those events became widely known. What they do not establish, however, and what no responsible observer can claim to know, is the relationship between those points. Suicide is not a single lever pulled by one external stressor. It is multi-causal, often invisible, and frequently unknowable even to those closest to the person. People end their own lives for reasons that can include untreated illness, trauma, medication issues, family history, isolation, professional anxiety, emotional instability, or a convergence of internal circumstances that never surface publicly. To isolate a single moment and declare it as the reason is to replace uncertainty with a story. Some will look at the chronology and feel that the accusation must have been decisive because it preceded the death. Others will read Eileen Holoka's statement and conclude that the internal struggles she described are already overwhelming long before anything became public. Both reactions are human and neither can be verified. The only defensible position legally, ethically and intellectually is to accept the limits of what can be demonstrated. It does not defend Quinn to say that causation cannot be proven. It does not defend Holoka to point out that allegations alone cannot explain the decision to end one's life. It simply acknowledges that speculation is not evidence. Regardless of what you think or feel, a family lost a son and a brother who, according to them, had already been struggling for a long time. After years in which Quinn was discussed almost exclusively through the lenses of harassment, media framing and identity politics, a Kickstarter appeared to offer something concrete. In 2015, Quinn launched a campaign for a narrative-focused game presented as an opportunity to expand on the themes associated with Depression Quest: intimacy, marginalised perspectives and a design philosophy that emphasised emotional texture over mechanical depth. The pitch did not promise technical innovation or complex systems, it promised a specific experience shaped by Quinn's voice. Backers responded enthusiastically, contributing more than $85,000. The confidence was not rooted in a catalogue of shipped titles, it was rooted in the belief that a developer who had occupied so much cultural space might, with proper funding, finally deliver a finished work. The campaign page introduced collaborators, outlined broad ideas and sketched an approximate timeline. Regular updates were part of the implied contract, and the expectation was not flawless execution but transparency. For a time, this expectation seemed to hold. Quinn posted development notes, discussed creative challenges, and occasionally shared early concepts, mock-ups, prototypes, and fragments of direction. The tone suggested progress, even if the concrete milestones remained distant. But as development continued, the nature of the communication shifted. Updates arrived less frequently and gradually moved away from what had been achieved towards what had made progress difficult. The subject began to drift from implementation and scope to personal strain, logistical hurdles, and stalled momentum. Eventually, Quinn informed backers that development had ceased. The explanation was that the funds had been spent during earlier stages of work and the project could not be completed. The message did not accuse anyone of sabotage, nor did it invoke harassment or identity politics, but it acknowledged an outcome. The game would not be made, and there was no remaining budget to return. At this point, people often attempt to supply motive, but the record does not support any definitive claim. The Kickstarter promised a game, but not a guarantee. Many crowd-funded projects fail for familiar reasons: underestimated scope, creative disagreements, lost collaborators, burnout, or organisational mistakes that leave no visible trace. The law treats these failures as part of the inherent risk of backing a creative venture unless there is evidence of deliberate misrepresentation. In Quinn's case, no such evidence has ever been presented publicly. The disappointment, though, is understandable. The desire for accountability is understandable as well, after all. When a creator solicits public funding for a specific work and that work is not completed, the absence becomes part of their public narrative. Unlike the controversies that can be reframed through harassment, misogyny, ethics, or personal behaviour, the Kickstarter has no interpretive shield. There was a pitch, a budget, and an outcome, but unfortunately, no game to be played. By the time the Kickstarter faded and the Holoka tragedy receded from the headlines, Quinn was no longer primarily discussed as a developer. She had become a reference point, and her name was invoked to explain a cultural moment rather than a body of work. Media outlets and commentators rarely framed her in terms of deliverables, shipped projects, or her place in the craft of game development. They framed her in terms of persecution, hostility, and the social meaning of her survival. To outside observers, it became difficult to tell whether Quinn was actively shaping her reputation or whether a reputation had formed around her and continued to grow independent of her output. The language used to defend her solidified that shift. Polygon had presented Depression Quest as an experience that helps dispel myths about depression, privileging its cultural purpose over its mechanics and positioning Quinn's role as one of emotional insights rather than design craft. Kotaku's coverage preserved that framing by documenting the threats and doxing she received. These accounts did not merely report events, they reinforced a particular image, Quinn as a person to whom harm was done, rather than a creative whose actions might attract any valid criticism. When commentators attempted to explain the wider fallout of the Gamergate era, they widened the frame until Quinn became less of an individual in a dispute and more a symbol of a hostile environment. Once this posture became dominant, Quinn became extraordinarily difficult to discuss without stepping into one of two pre-selected narratives. For her supporters, she represented the destructive impulses of gaming culture, an example of how vulnerable figures could be targeted and driven out. For her detractors, she represented the industry's insularity, a reminder of how institutions would close ranks around insiders while treating criticism as hostility. In both cases, Quinn functioned as a symbol. Her projects, professional relationships, and career decisions were rarely examined with the neutrality that would have been applied to an ordinary independent developer. When a crowdfunding campaign failed, or when disputes arose around her conduct, one side folded it into the story of harassment, while the other cited it as proof that she was never qualified for the platform she occupied. Symbols take shape when enough people find it useful to treat a real person as shorthand, and once that process begins, the individual loses control over their meaning. Whether she attended festivals, launched a Kickstarter, or withdrew from view, she was interpreted through forces that were only loosely connected to her work. In the end, the myth of Zoe Quinn became more durable than the person whose career it purported to describe. After everything that has been said about Quinn, the facts themselves are not complicated when stripped of the ideological framing. Quinn released a game that was covered primarily for its subject matter than its mechanics. She was thrust into a public crisis when her former partner published a detailed account of their relationship with screenshots, logs, and timelines, and she became the subject of real harassment. This is all true, but this doesn't make the criticism from many of her detractors any less valid. They noted the blurred boundaries between journalists and developers, the appearance of conflicts of interest when coverage overlapped with personal relationships, a crowd-funded game that raised more than $85,000 and never shipped, and the fact that when Quinn brought the Alec Holoka situation public, the proximity to his death encouraged speculation, and the family itself urged against turning their grief into a weapon. What makes Quinn polarising is not that she's uniquely virtuous or uniquely malicious. It is that this industry around her has turned her into a symbol before she was ever allowed to be understood as a working professional. People were encouraged to read her life as allegory. Supporters interpreted setbacks through the lens of misogyny. Critics interpreted projects and disputes through the lens of credibility. Quinn did not design that transformation, but she did not escape it either. She became a surface onto which others projected arguments about the culture itself. There will always be those who insist everything that happened to her was deserved because she behaved recklessly, and those who insist every criticism was misogyny disguised as concern. Neither of those positions explains why a Kickstarter failed, why a breakup document resonated, and why a handful of articles became the centre of a culture war. If the Quinn story reveals anything, it's how unprepared the games industry of the early 2010s was for the intimacy it practiced. It rewarded closeness, blurred boundaries, elevated personalities and rarely asked for accountability because no structure existed to demand it. When that ecosystem encountered a wider audience that rejected insider logic, it responded as most subcultures do when threatened. It treated criticism as hostility and hostility as identity. Quinn happened to be standing in the middle of that collision. Some of it benefited her, some of it harmed her. Some of it harmed the people around her. Very little of it was simple. She became the mirror in which the industry and its audience chose to interpret themselves. A figure used by institutions, judged by the public, and lost somewhere between those two lenses. And don't forget that you can use my links to make huge savings on many new releases. We're talking 30% off the critically acclaimed Ark Raiders, 52% off Expedition 33, and brace yourself, 97% off of one of my all-time favourites, Shadow of Mordor, bringing it down to less than $2. In fact, clicking below, you can always save up to 90% off of thousands of games. But since it's Black Friday weekend, every single hour, someone gets their entire basket refunded. So if you're thinking, I'll wait until payday, don't. And if you want to support what I do in a more personal way and access my behind-the-scenes cosplay library and more over on Patreon, and I'll see you all again soon.